Lisa, how do you pronounce?
Uh-oh. I think we lost JP. So I'll get him back in when he rejoins. All right. JP, we'll wait for you to get back on video.
Thank you. I'm here.
Wonderful. All righty.
We good?
Yes.
Okay,
Great.
let's begin. That good, Tiffany?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining our broadcast this evening. My name is Hank Richardson, and I'm a member of the board of directors at MODA and director of design at MAD School of Ideas. I'm here this evening with MODA's community engagement manager, Tiffany Ricks. Tiffany, raise your hand, a little high there. And Tiffany made this program happen. Thank you. And it's always somebody behind the scene that really makes things and pulls them together and makes it, and that's Tiffany tonight. So big thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, MODA defines design as a creative process that inspires change, it transforms lives, and it simply makes the world a better place. We believe in design as a powerful agent of change. And this evening, we're here to talk about a film that chronicles a design movement that radically changed the world and continues to change the world, the new Bauhaus, and specifically the work of Molinage. And I hope everyone had time prior to watch the film, but if you didn't, you'll still be able to gain a lot from the conversations that we're about to have. So let me get started in introducing those who are going to do the talking. Alicia Namis. Alicia is an award-winning filmmaker and founder of the Los Angeles-based production company, Engine Films. She's been producing and directing documentaries for over 15 years, embarking on her debut feature, Unfinished Spaces, co-directed with Benjamin Murray, which has won so many festival prizes, was broadcast on Netflix and PBS, by the way, and is in the permanent collection at the Museum of Art in New York. She released the new Bauhaus in 2019. JP Williams, JP, a little sign from wherever you are on the screen. And Alicia will be in conversation with JP Williams. JP is a creative director and an established authority on graphic design. He was educated at RISD, or the Rhode Island School of Design, and at Yale University. And he has taught graphic design at Parsons School of Design and the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. He is the co-founder of MW, a New York-based design studio, and Williams & Co., maker of everyday objects elevated by design. JP also curates exhibits and designs interiors for selected clients. And JP is honorably in Portugal right now and coming to us at 11 p.m. his time. So thank you also for that, JP. And I would just add a note, JP is one of those individuals that had the opportunity to study with a lot of people that were very participatory in the new Bauhaus, and even those one step away from it, for instance, Paul Rand. And so as Alicia and JP chat about the film, please feel free to put your questions over in the chat box, and somewhere about midway through the program, we'll turn to your questions and we'll begin to let them help shape the conversation as we go. So JP and Alicia,
Yes.
take it away.
Super. Well, it's lovely to meet you, and I feel like I've watched Maholi quite a bit this week.
Okay,
And visiting my
good.
school days as well. It's very fascinating to do that. And I very much enjoyed the film. I looked at some of your other pieces that you've done. It was very exciting, and it's always lovely to sort of revisit our art history days, and that's what happened here. And one of the things I wanted to start the conversation with was here is that usually whenever I see a documentary, and I'm always interested in the director, the writer, what they're doing is how they decide where to start. And usually you say you start at the beginning, right? But this time I actually want to start somewhere else. And I wanted to start with something I thought was really fascinating in the film, and the fact that you had Hans ask these questions and read the answers from Maholi. I love that. I love his stylized world, and I loved his hand gestures, which are great. I'm a big fan of his. So I think that was a really star choice. But the one thing that he read very early on was that he quoted Maholi saying, "It is not the person ignorant of writing, but the one ignorant of photography who will be illiterate of the future." And I have not familiar with that quote, and I unfortunately don't have my library, so I wasn't able to pull out all my Maholi stuff. But one of the things I thought is that I just did a quick internet search or whatever, and it realized that 6.4 billion people have a smartphone with a camera. That's today. And also I read where 1.8 billion photographs are uploaded every day from social media, 1.8 billion, which I think is pretty remarkable. And I would like you to sort of speak a little bit about where you think Maholi landed in that regard with that quote. And is it that he was just, I would just love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Well, thank you so much, JP. It's really wonderful to be here with you. And I just want to take a second to thank Tiffany and Hank and everyone at MODA for making this possible, and just acknowledge everyone who worked on the film with me. I won't say all the names, but the funders, the collaborators, it was really a wonderful process. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you in this space today. And we're sort of, Zoom is a whole other thing, right? When it comes to our digital lives now, and what would Maholi think about this? And I mean, that quote is so it's prescient, right? It's really, I think it's 1923-ish when he wrote that. And he's obviously already becoming obsessed with the camera and its potential as a tool. And I think one of the things that's fascinating to Maholi that we can take with us in this sort of digital age, even though he was working with analog photography and maybe couldn't have foreseen the billions and billions of infinitely replicable, everlasting images that are in our culture, is that he wanted, he had this concept of production and reproduction, right? How do you use photography or any technology in a way that is reproductive, just reproducing reality, or sort of trying to replicate it in a way? Or there are ways to be productive with it, which he defined as transforming it a bit, maybe even using the tool like the camera in a way that it wasn't intended to be used, right? Doing something unexpected with it. And I think that that's something that is fascinating. And when you have so many people taking photographs, and with these smartphone tools, how can we continue to be what he called literate, right? Like the image literacy, and what it means to think about images, to sort of speak the language of images, and to use the tools that we have that create images and reproduce them in interesting new ways. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I think about when I think about how that quote could have meaning now, and and which sort of artists or cultural workers are using the tools at hand in ways that are creative, new, and very much speaking the language in a way that so well that it can be poetry, you know?
Mhm. I mean, it's interesting to
What do
me
you think about?
because,
Yeah.
well, I'm a little overwhelmed by the fact that, like, when I Googled that and it was like 1.8 billion pictures are uploaded today, it's not, the day's over almost for me.
Right.
So,
It's
um,
overwhelming.
and I've always been a big admirer of Moholy's, obviously his photograms. And I also came to learn that he, quote, coined the phrase photogram. But I was spent a little bit of time sort of digging through that aspect and realizing that he made a lot of really amazing choices. And the choice to be in Budapest and start working with Ma, the magazine, that really, I think, probably fed a lot of his knowledge with the avant-garde typography. You had Stiersky, all these amazing people that were a part of that group. And then he goes to Berlin, and you have Schwitters and Hanover. You have Litsky, who was there between 20 and 25. I mean, I just sort of cursory sort of looked at all the people that was done there. And I was fascinated by the fact that he was not aware of a photogram, that he had to learn from some radical feminist, whatever that was. I mean, I tried to do some more research about that because I'd never heard about those things. But Lazitsky had done the advertisements with Pelican. So he had seen other photogram type works, I would imagine. And Malevich, I think, had a show in 27 or something. So the constructivists, he saw it all from the magazine Mao. I guess that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure. So I'd love to stay in that world of the photogram, and I understand that it's all about light for him. But I found it really fascinating that, like, rayograms, Man Ray, coined his own world, and he was making those in the early 20s. And so I got the impression from your film that, like, he really loved the photogram, that he loved just the direct relationship to the light. And I was
Yes.
surprised that, like, he was not aware of the cyanotypes of the 19th century or whatever. So I was very fascinated by that making part. I actually took my daughter when she was 10 into a dark room and let her make photograms, and she loved it. So
Right. It's sort of such a way. I think Moholy understood it as a way that a visceral way to understand and teach photography, and its concepts at its most sort of basic level. I have a photogram back here, by the way, if you can see it, kind of where
I
my
see
thumb
it.
is.
Yes. Yeah.
That actually was made in the dark room in the making of the film, where we have the scene. And I actually don't know how many people have seen the movie here, but it's not like a terrible spoiler. But there's a scene in the film where the artist Jan Tiki goes into the dark room at the Art Institute of Chicago and demonstrates photograms. He's actually making his own work, and that's actually one of the prints that he made that day with us. And so, yeah, we wanted to show that in the film too. Like, what does this process look like? What can it look like in a dark room? And there's something almost mystical about it, isn't there? When the paper, when the image from changes, the sort of impression of an object is left there. And I think Moholy is sort of endlessly fascinated by that, and he understands how it's going to force students in the curriculum to think abstractly and to think about material and light and these sort of basic elements of our world, but also of art making, and question them. And it sort of puts certain limitations on what can be done in the black and white and all of that. So I think that he, and yeah, he wasn't, he grew up in a small village in Hungary, and then he was in the war, and he didn't grow up in a sort of artistic literary milieu in the city or anything like that. And so I'm not super surprised that he didn't know about some of these things. He didn't go to art school, but yes, then he was in these circles where I think things were being talked about. And then obviously Lucia Moholy is where he, Lucia Schultz, who becomes Lucia Moholy, is the one that really teaches him about photography. And she's an extraordinary photographer herself. And she's the one that brings him to these communes where they sort of understudy with women who have been practicing cyanotype and photogram in a way for years. So I think that, but it's interesting how yeah, Man Ray is also doing similar experiments, and they're not new. It's not, but it's these kind of artists now fine artists bringing in, like photography wasn't considered a fine art, right? It was a practice that, take pictures of the family or document something. And in the sort of 20s, and Moholy's one of the artists who brings photography into the gallery space, right? And into the fine art world as something of value. And so how value is constructed is fascinating, right?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that this brought for my forefront was sort of look back at the chronology of, you have Stieglitz with the camera magazine, and that's the early, photographing George O'Keeffe's hands and all those aspects. I happen to be a very big creative director relationship to photography. I love photography and I choose photography a lot. And I actually have a personal experience with, I actually commissioned a well-known photographer named Albert Watson years ago, it's been many years ago, to do a photogram from me for a brochure. And he delivered it to me and he said, this is the first commercial photogram I've ever done. It's this beautiful thing. And he wouldn't sign it for me. Years later, I called him and asked him to sign it. So I'm a big, and so this comes back to the teaching, and the aspects are is that in 25, he did the Bauhaus book number 8 of the photographs. It's the beautiful photogram on the cover, and it's a great polemic book about teaching. And I actually own that book. That's a very famous one from that series. It's actually one of the most valuable ones of that series. It's fascinating how certain ones don't have value and certain ones do, the world of book collecting. So it's interesting that they also say that when he was at the new Bauhaus, he actually didn't teach photography.
Right. I don't know that there was photography taught. Photography was everywhere at the Bauhaus, and students were taking photos. As you can tell, they sort of and documenting their creative processes, like with the Schlemmer plays and performances and the fun that they had with photography. But yeah, I don't think it was a course. And Moholy taught the 4 course, the beginning course at the Bauhaus. He took over from Johannes Itten, and sort of the rest is history. Moholy was interested in he was sort of so influenced by constructivism then, and Lucia was the one that was really immersed in photography. And she took, many of the famous photographs of the Bauhaus are taken by Lucia. They're misattributed to Walter Gropius all the time. He's the architect of the buildings, but he didn't take those photographs. Lucia Moholy did. And there's a whole project, like a curatorial project, actually, that Jan Tiki and Robin Schuldenfrei, who are in the film, have been working on, related to Lucia and sort of her negatives and the ownership and authorship there, which is fascinating. And, Moholy then started to take photographs in Berlin more after the Bauhaus and continued after that. It's a through line in all of his work in Chicago, and it's very much an educational tool. And if you went to art school at any where there was anyone who has the Bauhaus DNA, you probably made a photogram, as part of your photography class. But teaching photography, that's part of the legacy of the new Bauhaus in Chicago. As we talk about in the film, the Siskin and Callahan and their students are the ones that actually start photography departments all over the US.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I find that one of the most fascinating aspects, because I did go to Rhode Island School of Design. I actually went to several other universities, but and Harry Callahan, of course, was responsible for their program at RISD, and very, very famous, and Richard Benson and people like that. So I'm very familiar with that. And then going to Yale, you had Walker Evans. It was associated that Herbert Motter. It's interesting. A lot of the images that you show for the Container Corporation were actually photographed by Herbert Motter. And he's not necessarily mentioned in this film, but I think he was a part of that whole group. And
had you heard of the new Bauhaus? Sorry, but like knowing that Callahan had started. Okay, so there was a knowledge that Callahan came from Chicago and brought this sort of new Bauhaus School of Design philosophy.
That's correct. Right. And what's interesting is that when you we talk about Gropius hiring Kandinsky and Klee and Schlemmer, and you think of all these icons, or not icons, just these huge heavyweights in the history of design and performance and what have you, and the avant-garde. And then you see Laszlo Moholy-Nagy going and then hiring his own people who are just as legendary, just as amazing.
Yeah, Kepish.
And he's actually a very not a very mentioned, he's not even mentioned in the history books, Tepish, I don't think, and he wrote his book.
Not enough. Yeah, and he's a
Yeah,
very
no.
influential teacher and writer. Mhm.
Yeah, and so he did his book, and I noticed that Vision in Motion was from 1947, I think, so that published after he died. And
Exactly.
then Paul Rand's Thoughts on Design was 1948. That was his first book, whatever, and then that propagated quite a few other artists. Ali Excel, who was in Switzerland, in Sweden, published his own group of books not too far after that. When he saw Paul Rand had written that book, he's like, I can do this too. His has actually never been published in English. So I'm fascinated by that whole teaching aspect, and I certainly am a product of all of that first or second generation teachers. And I thought it was really interesting that you make that parallel. And I also believe that when Albers landed, he went from Black Mountain and he went to Yale. He hired a lot of other people, that were really famous. And I thought that was, and those were all of my teachers, as that generation of the people. And then they then graduated and went out into the world and created. Rob Roy Kelly went to Arizona and whatever. You have Tom Coleman went to Indiana. You have a lot of other teachers that set up those programs around the world. Ken Hebert, who went to Basel, came to PCA at Philadelphia University. So
Yeah,
all of these heavyweights. Yeah.
That was a big part of the kind of process of thinking through this big question of what is legacy for an artist? What does it mean to have a legacy? And, there are certain artists where there's one iconic work, there are many great works and many well-known works, but often there's Picasso with Guernica, or, this sort of iconic, identifiable work. And Moholy didn't really have, he has the light space modulator, some of the photograms or photographs that are kind of well-known, but there's not that one thing. And in some ways, what I came to in terms of the argument of the film is the school and the teaching are that thing, that is something that is so iconic and powerful that it is almost like DNA. It's so, we don't see it. We don't always know it's there, but it's influencing everything, in generations of artists in the US. And it's related to these other schools, to Black Mountain College, to Harvard, to, and so I think that that's fascinating. And it kind of makes you think about what is, and Moholy's writing is part of that, of course, his theory, as you pointed out at the beginning, these incredibly prophetic quotes and syntheses about visual culture. And so I think that that's something to think about, what in this culture of sort of icons and famous people, why isn't Moholy famous? Well, it's because his legacy, wasn't the same. It wasn't this sort of thing that you can just say, oh, they did that, the guy who did that. It's more complicated than that. It's more nuanced, and it's much more widespread,
It's funny because you bring up Picasso when we think about how many different things he touched, from ceramics to, he did everything. And it's funny because I think there's a certain amount of criticism that also can be labeled at, like Joseph Albers, who was a certain teacher from the Bauhaus, and that they're parallel in a certain way, and he doesn't get his due. Kay Larson wrote, I think years ago, for a review of the Albers exhibition or whatever, it's they basically said he was just a teacher, and didn't look at his paintings. And then Donald Judd wrote a lot about Albers and thought he was an actually amazing painter, and that he didn't get his due. So I do think that there's a certain parallels to the idea that those who can't teach and those who do work, and I've always felt that was really unfair for some of these great people and who were incredibly talented,
Yeah, it's not, obviously, if you've seen the movie, I don't subscribe to that belief,
Indeed.
And so I think in some ways the film is a love letter to teaching, and to its power and to the passion of Moholy, who did that. And another important way we're thinking about legacy in the film is through Hattila, through Moholy's daughter, and the personal, inheritance that she has from Laszlo, and also from her mom, Sybil, who was a great architectural historian and writer. and what does it mean to carry on a legacy, and sort of and the and it's the physical works, and it's also being the custodian of the narrative of the story, and it's the perceptions about her. And so that I found to be like, once I met Hatala, I knew we had a movie that had some depth and emotion, in addition to obviously like the interesting historical resonances. And so then it was like a question of how to weave that all together too, right? Like to be able to reference the influences, the history, the personal, the contemporary. And you pointed to that at the beginning of the conversation when you said like some people start at the beginning, but you didn't necessarily start at the beginning. And that was intentional, right? Like to sort of we start at the German Bauhaus, but then we go forward to Chicago, and then we come way back to early, Moholy's childhood in Hungary. And I wanted it to be collage-like in a way, like his photo montages, which are some of my favorite work of his.
Beautiful stuff.
They're so gorgeous, and the scale shifts there, and the ways that, but I wanted the film to like be Moholy in that way, not to imitate him, but to allow for the narrative to be non-linear. And that also allowed us to work in some of these implicit references and to skip around in time, where all of a sudden you went from, 19th century Hungary to Robert Brownjohn and a James Bond, title design. Because they're so close, actually. They're so closely related, but you don't, it's not always something we think about.
So it's a little difficult for me because I'm one of these people who jump around a lot. I'd like to think of myself more of as a butterfly who likes to go over here rather than someone who's disjointed. But the aspects are, as you mentioned, two different things here. You just said was the personal and
Yes.
speaking to his daughter or whatever. But one of the things that I don't really have an opportunity to speak to film directors very often. I have a couple of friends, but we don't talk, they don't make films like this that I know something about, more or less, But one of the things that's curious to me is that when you have the daughter speaking, but you also sought out some of the students.
Yes.
And it was so lovely having them speak about their time and what they learned and things like that. And I love the woman sharing her trash photograph and how it's like it was a really bad thing. And I loved that. Seeing them in their environment was really interesting. And I don't really want you to speak about what they had to say, but what I actually really want to hear is you articulate what you got from them, from their experience and the way they, style their house. And, did they stay modernist? What did they take with them?
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean,
and I'm curious,
Yeah. I wanted all their characters to come through as, they're so creative and interesting. The folks that we were able to include in the film, and there were some that we couldn't include in the final film who we did interview. And what was I struck by? So much energy when they talked about the school, in general, but also those memories for every single person we talked with at different ages were extraordinarily powerful and just made them smile and light up. Like it was palpable. And yes, their environments were connected. Even like Sumner Feinberg and Bia Takeuchi, who lived in, each of them lived in different retirement communities. And so they're in, little apartments, and some of them may be furnished, they come furnished. I don't know either way, but just special things they held on to. Like Sumner had a lamp, he ended up selling modernist furniture somewhere in the South. And I wish I could remember which city. He opened he was a fine modernist furniture dealer in the South. And Bia ended up being an architectural renderer. She worked at a big architecture firm in Chicago for many years, drawing perspectives. Obviously the photographers were super successful. Kenneth Josephson, a lot of them taught classes at the Art Institute or elsewhere. Barbara Crane, her studio is extraordinary. Like, when Bia Takeuchi says at the end of the film, Moholy was messier than that.
Messier,
It wasn't like a museum. And I think that's so interesting to think about, yeah, how we see art in these contexts that are oftentimes very sanitized, very, you know, they have to be kept clean, climate controlled. There's security guards. It's just so different oftentimes than the context in which art is made and produced, which are, you know, in many cases extraordinarily messy and beautiful in their own way. So I found that to be fascinating. So, you know, Barbara Crane's studio was very full, but she knows where everything is. She'd take you exactly where the thing is, you know? Same thing with Kenneth Josephson's house. So yeah, so that was a really beautiful, it was a wonderful opportunity to see each of these characters, and I intentionally wanted to film them in their environment so that you could get even a little glimpse of what that's like and the diversity there, but also I hope it comes through how passionate they are with those memories of Maholi.
Yes, I love that. And one little aside for you is that the Wagenfeld lamp that Maholi designed. So I went to the Bauhaus anniversary 2 years ago for the 100 years, and I went into the shop, and that's the best selling. They were 4 months wait for it. It's
Oh, wow.
so popular. It was really fascinating,
Amazing.
especially, I mean, everything was super popular the year of, if you owned any Bauhaus ephemera, that was the year to sell it.
That was the year. Well, it was
Because
interesting, you
it was,
know, how many people have come up to me at in-person screenings of this film and said, you know, my dad or my grandpa or my aunt had this wooden sculpture that they keep on their desk since I was a child. And it was this little wooden sculpture, and I used to touch it, and it was like, oh, they finally understood that wooden sculpture was a Bauhaus hand sculpture that their relative had probably made in school or had been passed down. So people kept those things because they had so much meaning, I think, for their development as creative people.
So I've been teaching design for 30 years at Parsons. I've been teaching lately at Brigham Young University for the last 3 years. And one of the things I find interesting is that how education has changed. And I'm a product of, there's a famous type designer, Matthew Carter, and he's the only person alive who has gone through the full series of hand cutting, pitching your type, painting the type, doing digital. I mean, like, he's just been, and he's the only one who's done that. His father was a famous punch cutter and stuff like that. And so when I see that assignment, and when I took my first 3D art class, we did that assignment where we had to make that, and we had to do the different scale. And one of the things that, is it Tanaka? What was her name? How do you pronounce her name?
Takeuchi. Yeah.
Takeuchi. And she was talking about all the things in school, and you had to learn the machines or whatever. And I had to do that before we could actually even work on the machines. We had to draw them all. And I still have my drawings of all the tools and things like that. So that was certainly, and there's a picture at the summer where all of the drawings are supposed to be, the tools are supposed to be hung up on the wall from the chalkboard. And we had to draw all those too. So my education came directly from the Bauhaus and Basel and all that sort of formula of teaching and learning how to draw a letter form and stuff. So it came very much as a memory for me to experience those things. And it's funny when you talk about, I'm going to skip a little ahead now. It's like the legacy. You mentioned the word legacy. And you mentioned Brown John, and Debbie Millman spoke about Brown John and Shemaev. And I was a big Serge Shemaev fan. I mean, that was a really interesting thing. And I actually knew Ivan Shemaev, and I have many stories about Ivan, and I interviewed him for many hours when I was in school. It was really fascinating. And I asked him many questions, and I did not know that he had been to the design school in Chicago. And I don't know, that's obviously where he met Brown John. And I think Brown John stayed there longer, and then he went to Yale and finished up with Albers and things like that. And I would like to tell you one story that will add to your stories, because Shemaev actually, worked for Lustig. And Lustig actually was blind when he was working for him. And Lustig would describe what he wanted it to look like, and Shemaev actually had to make it. And that's the story he told me. So I thought that was really interesting. But and it's fascinating that the attribute, and I can see the sound things that Moholy did, those film, and that I can see that in Brown John. I can see that in, you know, other the people who did this Pepsi commercials or whatever. I mean,
Yes, the gold shoals.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes. They owe a
Mhm.
little bit of little nod to Maurice Bender, who did Dr. No. So that had all the little dots and stuff in it. So, you know, where someone overlaps and someone doesn't, it to me is a very fascinating aspect of it.
Yeah,
And then
and the ways that they're overlapping with commercial and industrial culture in the US are fascinating. You know, when Bauhaus gets to Chicago, as we show in the film, it's this moment of boom at the beginning, and then the war hits, and it's just, you know, it's things are changing. So I think that you know, the ways that artists are navigating those spaces and relationships are fascinating. And you know, Walter Pepka, who funded the new Bauhaus in the first years and was a dear friend of Moholy's, he ends up founding the Aspen Institute as well. And with Herbert Bayer, you know, designing those buildings. And we actually just showed the new Bauhaus at the Aspen Institute too, at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and Pepka's grandson was there. And so that was fascinating. He said, you know, and he said, and his mother, so it was Pepka's daughter and the grandson. And they said, we felt like we were back with, you know, with Moholy. And it was in this space where that, like, even that sort of legacy is part of Bauhaus in America, and the sort of commercial and intellectual cultures meeting each other in certain ways. Whether it's the Gold Shoals doing a commercial for 7-Up, or, you know, the Container Corporation ads. I think all of that is remarkable, and the ways that the different artists influence each other through that. It was a story that hadn't been told, and that was part of the appeal to make this film, is to you know, to tell a story about America and a place and a time in America that expands beyond that place and time as well.
well, that's actually you're prescient yourself here, because that's actually what I was going to go, because your husband is a graphic designer. I read
Yes.
that, right? And
Yeah.
he didn't do the titles though. You didn't hire him to do your titles for this.
Not on
movie,
this film.
okay.
He has done the titles on my newest film, Art and Crimes by Crimes, that's with
Okay.
coming out this fall, and he did Unfinished Spaces. But actually, so the way I came to this film is I have a background in architecture too. I studied architecture at Princeton and worked for a little while as an architect before I became a filmmaker. And when I lived in New York, Rob, my husband, and I befriended Petter Ringbaum, who is formerly a graphic designer. I mean, I guess he'll always be a graphic designer, but he doesn't practice, you know, at a firm right now. And I worked on his film Shield and Spear. I produced with him, and it was about art and censorship in South Africa, contemporary South Africa. And then he had a relationship with the Institute of Design at IIT, was doing some documentary work with them. And so when the Bauhaus Centennial was coming up, that's how Petter and I started talking about making the new Bauhaus and what could we do around this interesting school in Chicago. So Petter does have a graphic design background, and he did the titles and the animation in the film. He's super talented with all of that.
Yeah, I thought that was very nice when he animated some of the collages.
Yeah,
You know,
we
yes.
like talked about, and the photograms, like I wanted people to feel like they were seeing the photograms emerging, you know, on the screen, and almost like you're in a dark room. So keep it really dark and let the photogram image kind of fade in and out, and then animating those photo collages to kind of suggest what Moholy, and we had Hatchela's blessing for that, where it was like, you know, as someone who comes from a background in art history and design, it's always like, I don't want to touch the artwork. I want to show the work as it was. But we all felt, you know, myself and Petter and Hatchela, that in this instance, it was going to be so clear that we were, you know, manipulating it in the service of sort of suggesting what Moholy was maybe trying to activate in that work, and that Moholy would have been super into it. If he'd had the technology, if he'd had After Effects, he definitely would have been an animator, you know?
It's interesting that you say that too, because I as a child, I was a big Ansel Adams fan. And then when Photoshop came out and all this different stuff, and I would say, and someone said, "Are you kidding?" They said, "Albert, he would have been all over anything to do with the technology to get that
Yeah.
done." And you can obviously see that. I never thought that was the case, but someone said who studied with Ansel Adams said that was the case. And I certainly think that Moholy embraced those things, and he seems to be precedent not just with the idea about the being illiterate if you're not into photography, but also the aspect that he did these phone call paintings.
Oh, yes.
Yes, you know, and I think taking away today in contemporary art and contemporary society as it relates to art and making art, that's probably the most like important. Like
It's very
act.
significant. Yeah, that
Very,
gesture.
very act. That's right. I mean, very Duchampian, you know, I mean, I think
Yes.
Duchamp would have really, I don't know what
Yes.
Duchamp thought about that, but
Well,
I
and
know that.
Fountain is Duchamp's Fountain is 1919, and I think the telephone
Okay.
paintings are 1921, if I'm not mistaken, 20 or
Okay.
21. So very, very contemporary with each other. Or is it
Mhm.
1919? Now I'm tempted to Google, but I'm not going to. But if somebody
Yes.
wants to, they might be same year. But in any case, I don't know what Duchamp thought of it, and it'd be so interesting
Yeah.
if he ever did comment on it.
Yeah.
But either way, it's asking about, like, the telephone paintings to me are asking about, yeah, does it matter? Is the hand of the artist what's important, or is the idea, the most important? And that's a constant tension in modern art.
And I think that the fact that you said a lot of the letters were written about the fellow teachers at the Bauhaus were very upset at his methodology, so to speak. And I thought that was really interesting because I had not read that he upset the cart, so to speak.
Well,
did that change over the years?
The Bauhaus was before Moholy came, you had Johannes Itten, Kandinsky, Klee, Gropius, obviously. A lot of them were painters, abstract, expressionist painters. And Moholy comes in with something like the telephone paintings, which are not handmade. They're not gestural. It's not expressive, in that same way. It's very much more constructivist and even proto-conceptualist, right? And so I think that's who, I think it's Robin Schuldenfrei who talks about how, some of the other faculty were not so pleased because he was calling into question the value of their sort of the value placed on personal expression in art, versus an idea. They're very solo-wit,
Yeah, well, it's a very important person, actually. Yeah, because you can still order one of those wall paintings. You can just do it and they'll come in, and there's a crew that come in and paint it. I don't know how many people know about those, but they're quite amazing. It's just that act in itself is sort of unusual to me. Some concept of an art that was developed 40 years ago, and you can call the Institute and buy one and they can come to your place and install it. I think that's an amazing thing.
And this was the concept of the telephone paintings,
Right,
and the fact that he did the 3 at different scales, right? To show, and that's very architectural as well.
So I've never seen those all together. I've never seen that before. And is one the drawing, or are they all just 3 metal pieces?
There are 3 enamel paintings, and I saw them at the show, the show that was at the Guggenheim and the Art Institute and here at LACMA in LA. They were all together. And then they were at Hauser and Wirth in London.
Who owns those?
I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. It might be still the estate. I wonder if Hattula does, but I don't know.
Okay. So, so we spoke about it's funny because I sort of feel that what most impresses me is his associations of like where he was at the moment. And I kept going back through and I wrote down the whole chronology, to sort of like, okay, in 1920 and 23 and 29, then I started doing my own research. Wow, that was amazing. That was in that year, that was 1963, and someone did this. And then I'm sort of like, wow, no, someone did that before. And then I looked at it, Malevich and the non-objective. And I was really interested because of all the non-objective art that he was painting. And I personally have always loved his paintings. Love his paintings. But what's interesting is that I always feel like the non-objective or the constructivist paintings of Liszewski, and how then they took the shapes and put them on dishes and things like that, that they believe that, like you say in the film, that a shape could change the world, that it meant something else. And then I wondered whether when it was taken outside of that revolution, what it meant, did it just become just form? Did it just become a relationship that we're trying to see what can be made? And I don't have my books to read, so I couldn't find out what he wrote to like have a little bit more information about it. But can you address that at all?
I mean, I think when you say like when it was put in different contexts, I guess it probably just depends which context, you know? I think there are going to be some, it's never going to be read in the same way in a different context,
Right.
probably. So I think you're right. I mean, and that is part of that power of abstract art, where it isn't just saying one thing all the time, you know, or showing one thing all the time. It is going to morph based on context to some extent. But yeah, I don't know what he wrote about that, about sort of abstract painting and or abstraction and its interpretation in different contexts. No, but I love what you were saying at the beginning too about him being at in all of these really potent places and times in history. And I think that's true. And I think he sought it. You know, he knew where the action was, and he wanted to be right in the middle of it. And I find that to be fascinating. Oliver Botar, the art historian Oliver Botar, who's Hungarian and knows Moholy so well, says that in the film. And we wanted to capture each of those places. One of the things I set out to do, like conceptually with the film, is to set the scene in all of those places using almost entirely our archival that was created by artists. So rather than using like generic imagery of a place, or, you know, newsreel footage, we always wanted to rely first on artistic representation of the place and time. So when you're in Berlin, you're seeing Moholy's videos of Berlin, not videos, his films of Berlin. You're seeing, you know, Hans Richter films when we're setting the scene for Berlin at that time. We're same thing with Chicago during the war. We're illustrating or representing the wartime using, you know, WPA photographs that were taken by artists, or using Container Corporation advertisements that were commissioned by contemporary artists. So you're really trying to, you know, it's subtle, like it's not labeled, you know, but I wanted to show the whole world through the eyes of artists as much as possible, because that's how Moholy is, you know, is perceiving the world, or his students. And we see Chicago through the photography that the students made. So yeah, so I think that hopefully that's part of what gives you that sense of him really being in that place, is that we're representing it either through his work or through the works of other artists contemporaries.
Yes, I mean, having like Leger come in and give a little talk that's kind of nice. I mean, when I was at Yale, we had David Solly, you know, came into the painting school. I mean, you get a little bit of that at those aspects, but I'm still overwhelmed by that association of what it was. And so here he is doing the typography. And I saw in the film that you had some of the letterheads or whatever, and Herbert Bayer was really in charge of the print shop for many, many things. And you can see at the bottom that he actually signed some of the letterheads. It says Herbert Bayer on the bottom, and they printed 1,000 copies or whatever. It's quite fascinating. And then Chickhold, of course, wrote Dinu Typography in 1928, which is the seminal, and he was out there with everybody, you know? So I've always been really, really keen on that aspect and when those decisions were being made. And you also mentioned the famous photo exhibition that was in the late 20s that he put together to show that. So it was really the spearhead of all of those things. And then coming to Chicago was quite a good thing for him, I think, to just have that opportunity. It was really interesting to see that Mr. Botar, the art historian, whatever, I actually downloaded his dissertation, 732 pages. 140 megabytes, because I'm a big Czech avant-garde fan. So he has a huge section of his dissertation about that. So I'm like,
Excellent.
okay,
He's
I'll do a
brilliant.
little,
Yeah, I
yeah,
love
really
Oliver.
very interesting. Yes. So,
Should-
I mean, I'm very interested in how all that worked. And I thought you really put all that together in a way that made me feel I should look a little deeper, you know?
Awesome. I,
But
I
it
think
is,
that's such a good feeling to leave people with, that they want to know
hmm.
more about something, that there's, a lot more there. But speaking of which, should we see what some of the chat
Yes,
questions are?
indeed. Yes. I didn't know if Tiffany was going to. Yes. One of the things we have, let's see, we have
Yeah.
this.
Great conversation. We can kind of segue to the chat. Lisa, John Robertson had a question, but also a comment right above. He wasn't. He appreciated the aspect. He wasn't a master of none, but it was a jack of all trades. Pop culture fame and influence are not the same thing, and of course, our cultural values the former. Point well made. So, John, did you want to come on and also ask your question? I can spotlight you if you like.
I think he's shaking his head no.
Okay, great. So John, how did this work on the film Things to Come, 1936, fit
Oh,
into this timeline of moving west? Did he go back to England to do that work? I'd be interested in anything you have to say about this work.
yeah. So that Mahoney briefly worked on a Hollywood movie that never came to fruition, if I'm not, or it was handed off to someone else. He was a set designer, a production designer for this Things to Come film in 1936. That was right before he came to the US. So I don't believe he went back to England. And in fact, I don't know the particulars of it, but it might have been part of why, it's either kind of part of why he left because he didn't have that work anymore, or also because he left, they couldn't continue with him. Yeah. He did, he shot some movies in the UK when he lived there briefly, and then was asked to be a production designer for this Hollywood film. So that's sort of like an alternate history, like choose your own. I don't know if he was choosing, but there could have been a very different trajectory for Mahoney becoming like a Hollywood production designer.
Yeah, that's my understanding, is that it was not his work on it wasn't used, and it was sort of an English Hollywood co-production, I guess.
I think so.
But for anyone interested, Criterion has put out a really nice Blu-ray of that, and it has as a special feature his work that was not used.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's
Very cool.
there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your
Thanks
question.
for sure. Awesome. Thanks, John. Jan Laurent, did you want to speak to your comment? I can spotlight you if you prefer. Jan said Mahoney's approach to design permeated the Institute of Design. When I was there from 73 to 79, the school evolved to focus on design thinking and losing the craft of design approach through craft. I believe that the Mahoney approach to education is no longer moving us forward in design. We seem to be at a point of stasis in design now, with the style being the driver versus experimentation. So,
yeah, when I was there for undergraduate and graduate, we still had the same program that Mahoney had. And in fact, we started out with Vision in Motion as a textbook.
Oh, wow.
A lot of the people that were with him were still there. And all the things that were shown in the film, we still did. And then now what's happened, which I'm sure you're aware of, the school transformed to design thinking, which is probably through Chuck Owen, which you may have met at some point. And it was kind of a overthrow of the Mahoney regime that was there. What I benefited from the program, and I think it was the reason I think there was some strength there between the design thinking component and Mahoney's component was, how do you think? And I think that's how he always talked about how it's not what you design or the style that you pick up. It's how can you think about or redefine the project. That was one thing that they kept talking about. How do you redefine the problem at hand, as opposed to just going to town and doing something that's going to be 60s modern or 80s modern or something, stylistically. There was no discussion about style when I was at the school.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and thanks for sharing your experience. And yeah, that was one of the branches of the lineage that's hard to visually depict, in some ways because there wasn't an emphasis on form and style, but this whole branch of design thinking, you know, corporate strategy, and that a lot of graduates of ID have gone into that world, and been very, very successful and contributed to, you know, redesigning systems and structures, from, you know, at all scales and in many different aspects of our culture.
The disappointment I have with the program, though, is that there's very little focus on the craft of
I
design.
hear you. Yeah, it's different.
All about, you know, strategy, almost an MBA.
Yes.
If a designer from the Bauhaus was going to become an MBA, that's where that
Yes.
into, and the inherent value of an MBA or an MBA-like designer is seen at a higher level than somebody that's going to hack out a piece of plywood and make it wonderfully tactile as we did. What's the value of that? Just like when you showed in the film, which was kind of interesting, when the industrialists
Yes.
had the program and then they put all these things out there that are, you know, touchy-feely, which we did. And, you know, what the hell is this? I mean, we can't make this thing work. And then somebody says, oh, maybe we can make a Dove bar out of it. All right. Yeah, we got it.
Right. The leap is easier seen in retrospect between that sort of formal experimentation and commercial viability.
So what I'm concerned about is not, you know, not only Institute of Design where it is right now, and also like the D School at Stanford, you know, when they focus on so much design thinking and so little on what is design inherent and what is aesthetics, what is, you know, how do you create new form, that seems to be missing. And I feel like if there, for a short time when I was there at the end, there was those two factions. They constantly got on each other's nerves. And one of them obviously won because there's more value in that as a world, contributing to the world of design thinking than there is
Arguably.
Yeah, so.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting insights. Big questions.
Yeah, I think if I can add a little bit, since I still teach design, and I was one of those people actually in '77 who made one of those physical things that you're talking about at James Madison University in Virginia. And I think that to sort of help a little bit of your pain is that as a teacher and looking at society today and understand what students are, and they all have their phones and they learn so much earlier design principles. 10, 11, I saw it through my own daughter, who was not an artist through high school. And as she got to be later in college, she actually got more interested in it. And I find that what is being taught then and what it needs to be taught now is different. It's just moved. And people who want to teach craft can go into an ID department at RISD. They have a great furniture department there. They have those things, but this design thinking strategy aspect is so much a part of society, right? And I think that's interesting. That's why I started with the whole question about photography, because I think that it brings it to everybody. Everybody's taking pictures. I'm here in Portugal and I see tourists all the time and they're all holding their phones, right? And how many people learn to take a photograph with their arms extended? It usually your lightest to your eye, right? You put the camera up, and people don't do that anymore. So I do think that the way to restructure teaching needs to be done in a way, and people are still trying to figure it out. And I felt that just when I was in grad school, I was being taught the same things that were happening 20 years before. And now all those people who went out into the world and started these programs, you now had to restart what a graduate program is all about, because now you have so many people that what do you call it? When the wave, not the wave, the high tide rises all boats. So exactly how to approach that, I think, is the big dilemma in art school today. I don't think you can even call them graphic design. I think it's a complete useless thing to say now, because it's so ubiquitous and about how we make these choices. So I understand where you are. I would love to have a long conversation with you about this subject, because it's something I'm very passionate about how to help people move forward, you know. And I love these great teaching moments, and it's so great to have this film, because it brings us back to ask these questions. And that's what teaching needs to do, is to keep bringing us back to ask those questions. And I think this is a perfect example of having that's what it does. Yeah.
Thanks.
Awesome. So we also have a statement and a question from Sue Youngblood. Love to spotlight you, Sue, if you're willing to come off mute tonight. She said she spotted a wood form and an alumni forum on Facebook. So let
Nice.
Sue speak to that.
Yeah, well, it was funny. I had just gone to Atlanta College of Art, which is now part of SCAD, and some of these students from, I think they were from either the 60s or 70s, and they had those little wooden shapes, and they were beautiful, but I had no idea what they were for. And then I saw the film and I went, oh my gosh, I should have known they had brought in his philosophy of teaching into that school. But my question to you is, how do you pick your topics, and how much did you know about him before you started? Because I knew a little tiny bit about him, but I had no idea. So I thank you for this film. It was delightful.
I'm so happy you enjoyed it and felt like you got to know, you know,
Yeah.
got to know an artist that you can connect with, and hopefully many artists, you know, who are in the film. So I don't know, sometimes I choose topics, but a lot of times they choose me. I don't mean to seem like overly mystical about it, but you know, they hit you on the head, maybe. They trip you in your tracks. And you know, my other two films that I've directed, Unfinished Spaces was my first film about the Cuban National Art Schools, and sort of trace the history of the Cuban Revolution through these emblematic structures that were designed and partially built but never finished, but always in use, and the architects who were invited to finish them 40 years later. And that film's out there in the world now, and I stumbled on that when I was on a architecture study trip in Cuba, and I met one of the architects who had designed these buildings, and he took me there, and he sort of double dog dared me to make a film when I said someone should make a film about this. And then that was like an education, you know, because I took him up on it and I couldn't let him down. And so 10 years later I finished the film, and then the new Bauhaus is my next, you know, feature doc as a director. I've produced with other directors as well, several films, but the new Bauhaus felt like it was related. It's also a sort of mid-century art school. In a, you know, Chicago is, I mean, I guess you could say like, you know, Havana and Chicago sort of couldn't be more different. And yet they're also these like commercial, you know, Havana is a hugely commercial epicenter of the Americas for many, many years. And then both, I think, but I think what's in common and what drew me to this is like a really particular place at a certain time when it's a transformative time. Obviously there's not a revolution, you know, government coup happening in Chicago at the time, but there's the war and Maholi's a refugee. And I was sort of interested in, yeah, this concept of modernisms that are like extensions of, you know, or sort of parallel to the stories we all know and the figures that we all know, and sort of thinking differently about that. So yeah, that drew me to the new Bauhaus. And then the other film that I just finished is called Art and Crimes by Crimes. And it's about a contemporary artist, Jesse Crimes, who I read about and couldn't stop thinking about it. He created this extraordinary masterpiece while he was incarcerated in federal prison, a 40-foot mural that he made inch by inch using bed sheets, stolen prison bed sheets. And he transferred images from the New York Times onto the sheets using a plastic spoon and hair gel. And it took him 3 years. And he finally saw it assembled when he came home. And I just thought that's another really interesting instance of art and institutions in a really specific context, right? Like the limitations of prison, the sort of upheaval that it represents. And so, yeah, so I think I'm interested in this notion of like big questions, big themes around how and why we make art, what is valued, and the relationship between like material structures and systems and individuals. And and finding beauty in sort of unexpected places. So yeah, so I guess I know it when I see it, and I also am really open. Like I really love next to do a music doc. I'd love to tell a story of a musician, and I'd be open to something in the sports world that also has like an intersection of culture, you know, and history or politics. So I'm not like exclusive to art and architecture, but it is, like I said, it's my background, and they tend to come to me.
And then how much did you know about Maholi prior?
Oh yeah, I had heard about Maholi and thought he was super compelling, like from school but I had only heard about him in the context of the German Bauhaus. So
right.
I did not know about the new Bauhaus in the School of Design in my design education. And so that was super compelling. And Petter as well, my, you know, collaborator on the project, who was a designer, he went to Cooper Union. He also had, of course, heard of Maholi, but neither of us knew much about this history of this particular branch of the Bauhaus in America. And so we thought, well, if we, you know, consider ourselves to be well educated in design, like this is something that we are interested in sharing with others and telling the story.
Yeah, well, thank you, because I'm the same way. I thought I had, you know, a pretty good background in the history of design. I was like, wow, you brought a lot more to it. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for watching.
I want to follow up on that actually a little bit because being in Chicago, Mies van der Rohe.
Yes, Mies
right?
is the name. Yeah.
Yes, so 46 was the starting of the, if I remember right, is the Farnsworth House, and obviously he died in 46, Maholi. But you don't mention Mies in the film.
Yes, good question. So this was a question throughout the filmmaking process: was how will Mies fit in? Where will Mies fit in? What is the story with Mies? We actually interviewed Dirk Heuvel, who's I hope I'm saying his last name, I'm trying to remember it, but who's Mies's grandson. And at the Lakeshore Drive.
The towers.
Yes, he lives in Lakeshore Drive.
That's right. Exactly. Yes. Right.
And actually, Patrick Whitney, who's interviewed in the film, if you noticed, his interview is also at
lives
Lakeshore Drive.
Too.
Yeah,
yes. I knew that right away. So I'm like, okay, that's the Mies buildings. You know, what's the scoop? Yeah.
Right. So Mies is in the film in Patrick's apartment in that But in the end, I try, you know, actually the first sort of fundraising reel that I cut had Mies in it, and sort of the, you know, what's the difference between them? There are different teaching philosophies, but it turned out that they really didn't have interactions in Chicago. They only overlapped for a little while. They kept their distance. We found out there was like one welcome dinner for Mies that Maholi was at but the school hadn't moved into, Mies came to IIT, and then the School of Design moved into IIT. So it was like, there just were these near misses, and the two of them didn't seem to have any, like, I couldn't find any documentation of like overt conflict or beef that they had with each other. They just seemed to not get they didn't meet, you know. They did meet, but they didn't, you know, there wasn't any real story except to say, oh, they were both in Chicago. And I feel like there have been so many films and stories about Mies, and I decided ultimately that, like, this is Maholi's story. This is his space. This is his Chicago. And I don't think that Mies was a big part of his Chicago at all, if any. You know, he was there in this really specific time and created this space. And then, of course, the schools overlap. And what happens later in the film is, you know, Mies is teaching downstairs, or sorry, the photography department at ID is downstairs in Crown Hall, you know, that Mies designed for IIT. So it ends up being that there's a little overlap of the school and the IIT campus that Mies designed, and the building is shared. But again, it just felt kind of forced to, it was like a footnote.
We'd never go upstairs, and they'd never go downstairs.
Oh yeah, you were exactly. It was very separate worlds, right? And so it was sort of emblematic that ID got put in the basement, and yet the people that I talked to, like yourself, are like, we loved it down there. We wanted it dark for the photography. We liked being in this. It wasn't as hot. The blazing sun came through those windows, and apparently it was awful for the architecture students.
Yeah, it was.
Am I right?
Yeah.
That's the same thing about the Yale School of Art, when by Paul Rudolph, it was also cooked all the students there too. So I mean, That seems
Right.
to be.
Yes.
Like,
So
you
it's
know,
like,
yeah.
those are fun facts and we could have done something like that, but it felt like in the end, it was just kind of me shoehorning into a Maholi movie that in a way that why, and I'm not against Mies, but he's definitely had his due and Maholi deserved, and the new Bauhaus
Well, I was
deserved
just
their.
surprised they didn't overlap. I mean, that's what I was
Right.
sort of done. Yeah.
It's astonishing because it's so close, it's so close. But I don't think that they sought each other out either. I mean, like there was something to where they just knew that they weren't gonna hit it off. I think they were such different personalities.
Mhm. I see that someone wrote another, well, two questions, actually. Your favorite part of making the film? Is that finally, is that the opening when you have the actual show? Or
My favorite part of making the film. I mean, I have to say my collaboration with Miranda Youssef, who edited the film with me and co-wrote it, was so wonderful. She is brilliant and we thought so much about the structure and I really loved that. And she's a talent. She's directing her first documentary now about an artist. I can't say anything about it, but I know you'll all be intrigued. And so I really loved that. And and meeting all the artists and meeting Hattila, that connection with Hattila is really special. Spending time at her house, the way she opened up her archives, her generosity with telling stories, and the people. It's always the people. I mean, why else make documentaries? Because you can't control them. If you're a director, you want to kind of be able to usually to be able to say, I want the frame to look like this. I want the lighting to look like this. I want you to say this. And say it in this way. But with docs, you can't really do that. And so you have to love the real people and knowing these real people who will be in your life and you'll be in theirs, and to tell a story that matters to them and do it in a way that feels authentic and feels like they can be proud of their story, so that feels really good. Like to have the premiere, you mentioned the premiere, like we showed the film in Chicago at the Chicago Film Festival as our world premiere. And we had, Kenneth Josephson was there and Barbara Kasten and Jan Tiki and Hattila and her sons and just so many people. And Barbara Crane had sadly passed away before, before we could show her the film, but her like longtime studio assistant was there and just felt so connected to her. And Bia Takeuchi's son was there. So it's just like, when you have that presentation, you have people come up to you afterwards and say, you did justice to my story, or I feel like I was back at the school. I feel like I was back with Maholi. Those are huge, huge compliments. And then you have students who you'd never met who came to the screening and say, I did the, like some, I'm forgetting, is it John who, you went to the school and I'm meeting you here. Like, that's lovely to have these connections at screenings. I love that.
So there's another question from Liz. How do you handle the politics that come behind creating a film that's based off someone's story? And how do you handle dealing with that negativity that can come behind that?
I'm guessing that this person might be a filmmaker or a writer who's working on some project that they have. No? Are they just curious? Okay, so
I was just generally curious. I have a BFA
Okay.
in photography and media, and I knew a lot of people have come and talked to us and directed films, and this was something that they faced.
got it. So this one was like, I don't know that there was a ton of politics. We obviously had a really good relationship with the school. ID gave us so much access, and IIT entrusted our team to go into the archives, to film at the school. I think, I'm trying to think if anyone like turned us down for an interview. I don't think they did. Some people were gracious. Elizabeth Siegel did 2 interviews with us when I was like, please, I need to do a pickup now that I've edited more. I know questions I want to ask you. And so we didn't really have negativity. I don't think we did, but we had, people are concerned. How am I going to be portrayed? You're giving a lot of power to somebody to tell your story. You don't know how big of a role you're going to end up having. And as a documentary filmmaker, I don't always know how big of a role you're going to have, because it's not like the script is there yet. I just know the questions I have and I'm exploring along the way. And then it doesn't come together until the end. It's like a collage. So So I try to treat that with a lot of respect and have people understand that there isn't a guarantee, but that we're all, you know, on this journey together, and we'll see how it comes out. So yeah, it was great.
And your selection of Hans was,
Oh yeah, Hans Ulrich Obrist. So
yeah.
so that was that was a process, and it wasn't until kind of late in the edit that I landed on it. And you know, I looked into working with, like, I was talking with like an A-list Hollywood actor who was maybe gonna play Maholi and just read lines but not be on screen. I mean, it's not like Brad Pitt or anything. It was a gentleman who you've seen in movies before. And I just was like, you know, I don't think that anybody should act like him. I actually think instead we should just have somebody reading the lines. And then Petter and myself and Aaron Wright, our other producer, who's brilliant, talked about possibilities. And it was actually Aaron who thought about Hans Ulrich. And you know, he has these long-standing projects where he quotes artists. Like, if you follow him on Instagram, he posts quotes by different artists. And I knew I wanted these passages that Maholi read from the Little Review, the questions. That's like an interview he did in this publication called the Little Review. And so I was like, maybe, and Hans Ulrich does a lot of interviews. So we thought about that, and I thought it was a great idea. And I thought, you know, he has this project that's like documenting artists, so it made sense for him to read it. And then Petter had done another short project where he had exposed, you know, a narrator and like filmed the narrator narrating. And so we adopted that framework, and he knew how to execute that with the cinematography beautifully. And Hans Ulrich surprisingly said, oh, yes, of course, I love Maholi, you know?
Yes, I love the particular shot of the glass. I really love that. It goes back to, like, you know, like 15th century Flemish something. It has so many references for me. It was just
it's
like
a still
oh,
life.
it's amazing. Yeah.
To me, it was like still life, and it spoke to light, and it spoke to Maholi's optimism and sort of the glass half full that he always, you know, people talked about him being a relentless optimist. But yeah, also just visually, like letting people have kind of a pause and just something to think on visually.
Hey, everybody.
Yeah.
We got to bring this to a close a little bit. And because this is
It's very late in
terrific.
Portugal.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
yes, indeed.
And
Thank you.
so what a great conversation. You know, as we bring this to a close, in the background, there's definitely some folks that need to be thanked. Kelly, Panina, Leslie Ann, Kareem, and Maurice. This was amazing. And you guys, just fabulous, you know, from the making of the film, the interesting, you at least have got to do more films like this. This is, you've got to do more.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope to bring the art and crimes to Moda at some point. So we'll see if that stars align.
We love new ideas. That was just amazing. JP, what a cultural nerd you are. I gotta tell you, you're awesome. And
no, I just love design. You know, I tell everybody that I have an advantage over everybody else because design is also my hobby. So it's one of those kind of things. So it's just something that I love, and I appreciate it, Hank. And I didn't get a chance to thank everybody for letting me do that.
If you've never seen JP's company that he mentioned, Williams & Co., go take a look at it. Some of the coolest things on the planet there. And Moda is absolutely grateful to each one of you for coming by, the audience for joining us this evening. And this conversation can continue, I think, Tiffany, right over on my Moda platform at museumdesign.org.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I'll carry those questions over, and feel free to carry on this conversation online.
If you enjoyed this conversation, you know, we invite you to get involved at Moda by attending the events or becoming a member or coming in by and see one of the amazing exhibits there. It is the only design museum in the entire South. And so please come and get involved.
That's not a surprise, Hank.
Right?
I'm originally from Alabama. He didn't say that at the beginning, but so I can say that, being from Alabama, I can say that.
And here's a special request that Laura asked me to put forward to you all. And as a board member, I can't tell you what an important program this is. But MOTA has this big summer camp program that teaches kids to think like designers while using STEM tools. And please come and get involved. The goal is to help young designers. Just think about it, all of us here today. What if we could have started when we were knee-high to a grasshopper? You know, it helps them become problem solvers in this world, and helps us perhaps when they start so young to create a just and equitable world that's out there. And MOTA works so hard to ensure that children who might not have the resources to join the camp are able to do so. So and it's free, and 51 kids attended this up to this. So contributions are accepted. $1, $25, $50, whatever. Please just contribute to it. It's an amazing cause. We're raising funds to invite children and get them there, hopefully to teach them to be kinder and smarter. And so it's all tax deductible for those of you that finance is. We'll put the link in the chat boxes. I think Tiffany could probably help us with that. But thank you with that pitch made. Thank you for considering and empowering future change makers as yourselves. And with that said, tonight has been an awesome night. Thank you for coming and doing this tonight. What a great conversation. I hope everybody took something away from this. It was great. I saw some friends that I haven't seen in a while on the broadcast. Sue, Jan, I saw you all. So thank you everybody for coming. Stay tuned for more from MOTA. Drop by, visit. It's an awesome museum. And so with that, good night to all. And
Thank you, JP. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. It's a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to
Have
meet
a great night.
everybody.
Thank
All
you
right.
to the
Take
audience.
care.
Bye. Good
All
night.
right.
so
Ciao,
much,
ciao.
guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
Tiffany. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, JP.
Bye.
Thank you, Lisa.